Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 7 from the Chemical Brothers, Further. So, we're reaching the end of the Chemical Brothers story with the last main studio album I have to talk about. At least not counting the Hannah soundtrack, which will get its own video, don't worry. Now, for the 7th album, they decided to actively push against what they'd been doing on Push the Button and We Are the Night, abandon their poppier side for the most part, and craft together a primarily instrumental album with just 8 tracks. Stripping things back, making sure there was no room for error, and the result was an album that seemed to be much more generally well-received than their last couple of albums. I mean, you still had people whining about how they're never gonna make another Dig Your Own Hole again, but I think that's just gonna happen for the rest of the Chemicals' existence. If Born in the Echoes didn't shut them up, then nothing will. But as for me, personally, this might possibly be my second favorite album of theirs behind Push the Button. I mean, the competition's really goddamn stiff, and I'm not sure if this is better than Dig Your Own Hole or Surrender, but I think the fact that this album only has 8 tracks is what makes it one of the strongest in their whole catalog. Like I said earlier, the fewer tracks you have, the less room you have to screw up. Sticking in a track like the Salmon Dance among the previous album doesn't screw up the entire thing because there's 11 other tracks and it's not necessarily going to make a huge impact. And that track's not actually bad either. But yeah, the Chemicals were super focused on this one, making sure it flowed really well, and aside from one transition, which I'll talk about, it flows seamlessly from front to back. This album is the only one of theirs that I think works better as one cohesive whole than it does as a collection of tracks. With all their other albums, there's always at least one track where, while it's not necessarily bad, I feel like you could take it out entirely and not negatively affect the album. Well, okay, I think Come With Us actually accomplishes this as well, but I think Further does it much better. Come With Us may not have any tracks I don't like or feel like I could take out, but Further is even tighter than that one, and I get more enjoyment out of it on average. So okay, there's only 8 tracks. Let's talk about them. You got our opener, Snow, and this one is interesting because it's such a mellow track. I mean, because they usually try to start you out on one of their big, explosive, radio-friendly singles. This one is neither big, explosive, or particularly radio-friendly. I mean, there's a lot of harsh, screeching guitar feedback in the beginning, then a lot of these airy female vocals, lifted me higher. As a side note, I did say this album was primarily instrumental, and while there are technically lyrics on more than a couple of tracks on here, they really don't remotely matter on any of the tracks on this album. There's no left-right on here, and if there are lyrics, it's like not more than like 1 or 2 lines repeated over and over. Snow is definitely pretty repetitive, but it is also really catchy and far from skippable. Especially since it then flows directly into Escape Velocity, which I'm pretty sure is the longest track they've ever released at just under 12 minutes long. And boy does it utilize every second, with lots of amazing build-ups and payoffs, driving beats and bleeping synth lines that pretty heavily resemble The Who's Baba O'Reilly at the end. While I do think this is the point at which the album really kicks into gear, I would not say this album suffers from second track syndrome like Born in the Echoes. It had the potential to, but they were smart, and made Snow directly lead into it and make Escape Velocity its payoff. And honestly, I think both tracks would be worse off if it were not for this choice. Another World isn't as inextricably linked to the other tracks on here, but it is a very impactful and emotional moment on this thing. A lot of these warbling synth pads and post-rockish build-ups in some areas. It's also one of the poppier tracks. You do have pretty catchy female vocals on this one, but again, the vocals are really understated, and it is more about the atmosphere and intensity than it is about being catchy. Kinda like a more intense version of Snow, sort of. And then there's Dissolve, which is kinda like one of those cool instrumentals from We Are the Night, like Saturate and Das Spiegel. There's a catchy guitar-heavy groove here and some quieter and more psychedelic-sounding moments, especially the Caroline, Caroline part, which has the vocals put through some kind of voice filter you'd hear in like some old 60s psychedelic tracks or something. Fairly certain the Beatles did it, but I can't think of a track off the top of my head which did. But for those people who just wanted something like Dig Your Own Hole, there's Horsepower, which is admittedly my least favorite track on here, as I think it's pretty repetitive, does not have a lot of interesting development, but I won't deny that its groove is excellent, living up to those darker moments on their earlier albums. and the crunchy, distorted voices saying the title over and over really do stick in your head. Horse power. And then it cleanly transitions into Swoon, which is easily my favorite track on this thing. Taking a fairly poppy chord progression and just running with it as far as they could. Going over the top with psychedelic distortion and barely audible vocals mixed in the background. There's nothing left. It leads to the entire thing being a huge emotional climax. They could have ended here if they wanted, and it could have been even more effective in ending than maybe even the private psychedelic reel. Well, maybe. I don't know. At least, maybe kind of on par. And honestly, you could end the album here if you wanted to, as this was the above-mentioned transition that does not lead directly into the next track. There is a silence in between Swoon and K+D+B, leading the last two tracks to feel like a tacked-on epilogue or something. I saw one comment on Discogs page for this album that said the last two tracks nearly ruined the album altogether and now to be removed. Though I would not go that far, as I really like the last two songs as well. K+D+B definitely leans more on their psychedelic side, taking some major post-rock influence as well. If you ask me, even though there is a silence in between the previous track and this one, it doesn't drop the momentum that Swoon had going, and it's possibly even catchier than Swoon. Higher and higher and higher. And then Wonders of the Deep is kind of like a slower and more cut down version of Surface to Air or something, with a lot of weird synth textures in the beginning, but leading to a triumphant rock-heavy climax at the end. The one problem I have with this track is that, sort of like Surface to Air, there's no hook, and nothing to make this track stick in my head. I mean, it definitely works well as an ending from an emotional and, like, instrumental level, and I really like how it bookends Snow pretty well, but they've closed out albums in more impactful ways before, and you had better potential for an ending 2 tracks earlier, so there is that too. Also, I think there's vocals from Tom Rowlands himself on this track, saying the title over and over, but it's mixed super low, and I didn't even notice there were actual lyrics in this track until preparing for this video. And I've been a fan for these guys for like 5 years or something. So yeah, Wonders of the Deep is a good ending, but it's not the best ending they've ever delivered. Oh, and there's also a bonus track called Don't Think, which they also named a live album after. Again, I think it's mainly something to scratch the itches of people who wanted something more like their old stuff, and it's some pretty awesome stuff too, with some pretty heavy disco grooves combined with their typical hard-hitting psychedelic stylings. Even pretty interesting, changing up halfway through with some other distorted synths. That being said, it is also just a bonus track, and works better as a completely separate single than an alternate ending after Wonders of the Deep. And I also have to mention the fact that this album comes with an experimental film as complementary visuals to the entire album. On one hand, video albums are awesome, and I wish it would happen more often. I know it takes a crap ton of work to do something like that, and most artists don't have the patience or budget for it, but it's always really cool when it happens. On the other hand, the further film sure as hell is not Interstellar. Like I said, it's an experimental film. It's with lots of really cool looking visuals, but nearly every visual element lingers too long on screen for my tastes, and makes this fairly short album feel like it drags on longer than it needs to. I mean, not the whole time, like the escape velocity segment with all the flying colored dots forming various shapes was pretty interesting, but you also got segments like Horsepower, which shows this admittedly pretty cool, like, origami horse or something, but just shows that same horse for the entire length of the song, just from various angles, and that's it. Or K+D+B, which the video is just like a sea of doves flying around the whole time, and that's it. I kind of found the film as a whole to be a little boring and kind of drag on, but then again, I think it would have worked a lot better if it were accompanying a different sort of album. Like, BT's This Binary Universe had a similarly slow-paced experimental companion film as well, but I think that's a much better fit for a much stranger and mellower album. And further, while strange and experimental by the Chemical Brothers standards, is still really up-tempo and intense and accessible when you really get down to it. I think could have used more visual variety to match the pacing and intensity of the album. But yeah, for what it's worth, the film doesn't actually come into play for my rating of the album. I just felt like discussing that. Regardless, I think Further is an excellent album. It's one of my favorites from these guys. As I said, I think it's super tight and super well put together and well thought out. All 8 tracks are really good and work together with each other. And there's not really much else for me to say. I think it's great that the Chemicals were still able to put out some of their best material this long into their career and still haven't shown any sign of getting tired. And yeah, I love this album. I would definitely give it my recommendation. I think it's one of their best. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.